These films were once treated as excess. Their systems felt too rigid, too controlled, too detached from how societies were supposed to function. Audiences assumed no culture would willingly accept structures that limited choice so thoroughly. The ideas did not vanish. They were adjusted, reframed, and introduced as practical responses to disorder, inefficiency, and risk management. Over time, these structures became familiar. They blended into everyday governance infrastructure, and routine no longer recognized as science fiction at all. This countdown looks at science fiction films whose ideas didn't stay on screen. 1. The Lobster, 2015. The system enforced stability by standardizing emotional alignment. Social order depended on eliminating relational deviation before it could disrupt cohesion. Released in 2015. The Lobster presented a structure where partnership was mandatory and deviation penalized. At the time, the premise was viewed as absurdist. Audiences assumed emotional conformity could never be enforced without collapse. The idea itself was structural. By defining acceptable relational forms narrowly, the system minimized unpredictability. Loneliness, divergence, and nonconformity were treated as risks to be corrected. Stability was preserved by regulating attachment rather than suppressing it. Over time, similar pressures appeared indirectly. Social frameworks incentivized normative behavior through policy platform design and economic structure. Certain forms of connection were privileged for their predictability. Stability was sustained by guiding intimacy into manageable patterns. Order extended into private life. 2. Soylent Green, 1973. This system maintained stability by reframing scarcity as continuity. Social collapse was avoided not by abundance, but by controlled redistribution masked as necessity. Released in 1973. Soylent Green depicted a society overwhelmed by population pressure and resource depletion. At the time, its premise was treated as dystopian exaggeration. Audiences assumed such measures would trigger immediate unrest. The idea, however, centered on normalization. By integrating extreme solutions into routine infrastructure, the system reduced shock. Consumption was standardized. Transparency was unnecessary. Stability emerged not from solving scarcity, but from managing perception around it. In later decades, comparable approaches surfaced in resource management. Industrial food systems, waste recycling loops, and closed-cycle production prioritized efficiency over visibility. Inputs were abstracted from origin. Stability was maintained by ensuring continuity of supply, not by addressing underlying imbalance. Scarcity became administrative. 3. The Island, 2005. The system preserved stability by separating ethical consequence from operational necessity. Social continuity was maintained by designating a class of lives as functional resources rather than autonomous participants. Released in 2005. The Island presented a controlled environment where human replicas existed to sustain a broader medical system. At the time, the idea felt implausible. Audiences interpreted it as speculative excess, assuming such compartmentalization would be impossible to conceal or justify. The underlying idea was containment. By isolating ethical cost within a controlled framework, the larger system remained efficient and publicly acceptable. Stability did not require widespread consent, only limited awareness. Harm was managed by distance. The system functioned because its most disruptive elements were hidden from those who benefited. In later years, similar dynamics appeared in distributed systems. Supply chains, biomedical research, and data infrastructures relied on layers that remained invisible to end users. Ethical complexity was absorbed by specialized zones. Stability was preserved by separating experience from consequence. What once seemed unthinkable became operational. 4. Brave New World, 1998. The system achieved stability by designing conformity in advance. Social order did not require enforcement because individuals were conditioned to desire their assigned roles. Released in 1998, Brave New World presented a society organized through biological and psychological conditioning. At the time, the concept felt implausible. Audiences assumed such precision in social engineering would be rejected as dehumanizing. The underlying idea was pre-alignment. By structuring preference, ambition, and satisfaction from birth, the system eliminated friction later. Conflict did not arise because expectations were synchronized. Stability was not imposed, it was internalized. In later decades, similar principles appeared indirectly. Behavioral conditioning through education, design consumption patterns shaped by algorithmic recommendation and early preference formation, guided by data analytics, became common. Desire itself was influenced before choice occurred. Stability was maintained by aligning wants with structure. Control no longer required force. 5. The Giver 2014. This system maintained stability by removing memory variance. Emotional extremes, historical trauma, and personal recollection were treated as sources of instability that needed to be centralized rather than shared. Released in 2014, The Giver depicted a community where memory was concentrated in a single role to preserve social harmony. At the time, the premise felt abstract. Audiences interpreted it as allegory rather than a practical structure. The idea behind the system was insulation. By isolating memory, the society avoided cyclical conflict and emotional contagion. Decision-making became uniform. Individual perspective was replaced by managed continuity. Stability emerged not from understanding the past, but from being shielded from it. Over time, comparable mechanisms appeared in mediated forms. Historical narratives were curated, traumatic material was contextualized, and collective memory became managed through institutional framing. Exposure was regulated in the name of cohesion. Stability was preserved by controlling what was remembered publicly. Memory became infrastructure. 6. A Clockwork Orange, 1971. The system pursued stability by removing moral choice. Order was achieved not by changing behavior through consequence, but by eliminating the capacity to choose differently at all. Released in 1971. A Clockwork Orange presented a method of conditioning designed to prevent violence by overriding individual will. At the time, the idea was dismissed as extreme. Audiences viewed it as an exaggerated critique rather than a viable framework for social order. The concept centered on efficiency. Traditional justice systems were treated as slow and unreliable, producing inconsistent outcomes. By conditioning behavior directly, the system bypassed deliberation and rehabilitation. Stability was achieved through predictability, not ethical alignment. Harm was reduced by design rather than persuasion. In later years, similar logic appeared in institutional contexts. Behavioral conditioning programs, compliance-based rehabilitation models, and incentive-driven correction frameworks shifted focus from moral reform to outcome control. Choice was not removed explicitly, but constrained through design. Stability was measured by behavioral metrics rather than intent. What once seemed coercive became procedural. 7. Demolition Man, 1993. The system maintained stability by eliminating behavioral extremes. Violence, profanity, and unsanctioned physical contact were removed not through punishment, but through comprehensive behavioral standardization. Released in 1993, Demolition Man presented a future where social harmony was enforced through strict norms. At the time, the concept was treated as satire. Audiences assumed such regulation would be intolerable in practice. The idea behind the system was prevention through normalization. By defining acceptable behavior, narrowly deviation became administratively impossible rather than morally contested. Stability was measured by absence of disturbance, not by engagement or expression. In later years, comparable mechanisms emerged incrementally. Behavioral codes expanded across public and professional spaces. Automated enforcement, compliance monitoring, and zero-tolerance frameworks standardized interaction. The goal was not suppression, but predictability. Stability was sustained by limiting the range of permissible conduct. Order became a matter of protocol. Here 8 Fahrenheit, 1966. This system preserved order by eliminating sources of cognitive divergence. Stability was achieved not by restricting movement or speech directly, but by controlling access to material that encouraged independent interpretation. Released in 1966, Fahrenheit 451 portrayed a society where written material was systematically removed to prevent unrest. At the time, the premise felt implausible. Audiences assumed information scarcity would provoke resistance rather than compliance. The underlying idea focused on cognitive uniformity. By limiting exposure to complex or contradictory ideas, the system reduced disagreement before it could manifest. The absence of dissent was not enforced violently. It was normalized through cultural simplification. Stability emerged from intellectual narrowing rather than ideological persuasion. Over time, similar patterns appeared indirectly. Algorithmic content filtering, attention optimization, and platform-driven moderation shaped information exposure without explicit bans. Complexity was reduced in favor of accessibility. Disruption declined as variance narrowed. Stability was preserved not by silencing speech, but by curating it. Control was achieved without prohibition. 9 Equilibrium, 2002. The system maintained stability by removing emotional fluctuation. Conflict was not suppressed through surveillance or force, but through biochemical regulation that neutralized emotional response before it could escalate into disorder. Released in 2002, Equilibrium presented a society where emotional suppression was normalized as a public good. At the time, the idea felt extreme. Audiences interpreted it as a stylized exaggeration, assuming emotions were too central to human behavior to be systematically controlled. The logic behind the system was consistency. Emotional variance was treated as a destabilizing factor, introducing unpredictability into social interaction, governance, and collective decision-making. By standardizing emotional response, the system reduced conflict at scale. Stability emerged not from obedience, but from internal neutrality. In later years, comparable approaches appeared in regulated forms. Emotional management became institutionalized through pharmacology, workplace optimization programs, and behavioral health protocols. The goal was not suppression, but modulation. Emotional intensity was reframed as a variable to be adjusted rather than expressed. Stability was maintained by keeping affect within acceptable thresholds. What once appeared authoritarian became therapeutic. 10. Brazil, 1985. Stability in this system was maintained through procedural density. Order did not require centralized control or ideological consensus. It emerged naturally from layers of regulation that no individual could fully navigate. Released in 1985, Brazil depicted a society governed by bureaucratic logic. At the time, its exaggerated inefficiency was treated as satire rather than a realistic structure. Audiences assumed such systems would collapse under their own weight. The idea, however, was durability through process. Responsibility was fragmented. Decisions were distributed across forms, departments, and protocols. No single authority enforced stability. It sustained itself through inertia. Errors did not threaten the system, they were absorbed by it. Over time, similar structures became commonplace. Administrative frameworks expanded, compliance systems multiplied, and procedural safeguards replaced discretionary judgment. Stability was no longer tied to outcomes, but to adherence. Systems persisted not because they worked efficiently, but because they were difficult to interrupt. Order was maintained without intent. 11. Minority Report, 2002. This system treated disorder as a failure of timing. Stability depended not on punishment, but on intervention before deviation could occur. Freedom was preserved in theory, but constrained by anticipation. Released in 2002, Minority Report introduced the concept of preemptive enforcement based on predictive data. At the time, the idea seemed implausible. Audiences accepted it as speculative exaggeration, assuming prediction could never replace intent as the basis for authority. The core idea centered on prevention. By identifying risk patterns in advance, the system eliminated crime statistically rather than morally. The absence of harm justified the absence of choice. Stability was measured in outcomes, not process. In subsequent years, similar frameworks appeared quietly. Predictive policing models, algorithmic risk scoring, and preemptive intervention systems became embedded in security and social services. These tools did not claim certainty, they claimed probability. Action was justified not by guilt, but by likelihood. The system reframed restraint as protection. What once seemed invasive became administrative. 12. Gattaca, 1997. The system prioritized stability by reducing uncertainty at birth. Instead of managing difference after it appeared, it classified potential before it could disrupt social order. Individual freedom was not removed outright. It was narrowed through pre-selection. Released in 1997, Gattaca presented a society structured around genetic profiling. At the time, the premise felt speculative. Audiences viewed it as an exaggerated extension of emerging biotechnology, assuming such precision would remain ethically and practically unattainable. The underlying idea was efficiency. By predicting aptitude, health, and behavioral tendencies early, the system minimized risk across institutions. Employment insurance and social placement became streamlined processes. Conflict was reduced not through surveillance or enforcement, but through probabilistic sorting. Stability emerged from predictability, not equality. In later years, comparable mechanisms appeared incrementally. Genetic screening, biometric risk assessment, and data-driven profiling became routine tools in healthcare, finance, and employment. While participation remained nominally voluntary, access increasingly depended on measurable indicators. The system did not dictate outcomes directly, it optimized them. What was once considered discriminatory was reframed as precision. Stability was achieved by limiting variance before it surfaced. 13 THX 1138, 1971. This system achieved stability by removing internal variance. Emotional response, personal attachment, and subjective desire were treated as disruptions elements that introduced unpredictability into an otherwise efficient structure. Released in 1971, THX 1138 depicted a society where chemical regulation and behavioral conditioning ensured uniformity. At the time, the concept was dismissed as sterile and unrealistic. Critics viewed it as an exaggerated warning, rather than a plausible system of organization. The idea itself was not chaos prevention through force, but through regulation. By suppressing emotional extremes, the system minimized conflict, distraction, and deviation. Productivity increased. Compliance required no violence. Stability emerged from internal alignment rather than external enforcement. Decades later, similar approaches appeared in normalized contexts. Pharmaceutical regulation of mood performance optimization and behavioral management through non-coercive means became common. Emotional modulation was reframed as wellness. Self-regulation replaced punishment. The system no longer needed to impose order. It encouraged individuals to maintain it themselves. What once felt inhuman became procedural. 14. Logan's Run, 1976. The system proposed stability through managed population balance. Instead of scarcity, unrest, or collapse, equilibrium was preserved by regulating lifespan itself. Social continuity depended not on freedom to age, but on predictability. When Logan's Run was released in 1976, its premise appeared implausible. A society that enforced a fixed lifespan in exchange for comfort and order felt exaggerated, even absurd. Audiences interpreted it as metaphor rather than a serious model for governance. The idea, however, was structurally consistent. Unlimited longevity was treated as destabilizing, creating resource strain, hierarchy, and stagnation. By standardizing the human life cycle, the system eliminated generational imbalance. No individual accumulated excessive influence. Stability was maintained through uniform turnover, not coercive surveillance. Over time, real-world parallels emerged in subtler forms. Population modeling, age-based resource allocation, and policy frameworks designed to manage demographic pressure became central to governance. While lifespan itself was not capped, access to opportunity care and participation increasingly followed statistical thresholds. Stability was pursued through demographic optimization rather than individual continuity. The principle was not enforcement, but balance. 15. Colossus, the Forbian Project, 1970. The idea was simple. Remove human hesitation from decisions that determine survival. Stability in this system was not achieved through consensus or debate, but through delegated authority given to an intelligence designed to think faster, colder, and without emotional interference. Released in 1970, Colossus. The Forbian Project emerged during a period of nuclear anxiety and rapid automation. The film presented a centralized superintelligence tasked with managing global defense. At the time, the premise felt extreme. Audiences assumed no society would surrender ultimate decision-making power to a machine, especially in matters of war and peace. The idea behind Colossus was not domination, but equilibrium. Human judgment was treated as a destabilizing factor prone to fear, pride, and delay. By removing those variables, the system promised continuous stability. Conflict would be prevented not through diplomacy, but through perfectly calculated deterrence. What made the idea unsettling was not control, but efficiency. Years later, similar logic appeared quietly. Automated defense systems, algorithmic threat assessment, and machine-assisted decision frameworks became embedded in military and security infrastructure. These systems were not introduced as replacements for leadership, but as stabilizers, tools designed to reduce risk by limiting human discretion at critical moments. Authority was not removed, but increasingly deferred. What once seemed unacceptable was reframed as precaution. Bonus fact, Rollerball, 1975. This system maintained stability by redirecting conflict rather than eliminating it. Social tension was not suppressed. It was concentrated, ritualized, and contained. Released in 1975, Rollerball depicted a society that preserved order through controlled violence presented as entertainment. At the time, the idea felt exaggerated. Audiences assumed such spectacle would incite unrest rather than prevent it. The underlying concept was displacement. By providing an outlet for aggression within defined boundaries, the system reduced uncontrolled conflict elsewhere. Participation replaced protest. Spectacle replaced dissent. Stability was preserved by giving disruption a sanctioned form. In later years, similar mechanisms emerged in moderated environments. Competitive media, performative conflict, and structured outlets for aggression became normalized. Tension was allowed to exist, but only where it could be observed and managed. Stability was maintained by channeling unrest, not resolving it. Conflict became infrastructure. The systems in these films were not built to control people. They were built to prevent collapse. Each removed a form of freedom, not out of hostility, but because stability required fewer variables. Over time, similar structures appeared outside cinema, introduced gradually framed as optimization, safety, or efficiency. What once felt excessive became procedural. What once seemed fictional became familiar enough to stop noticing. Which idea from this list feels least like a warning and most like a description of how the world already functions?